Humanity in Crisis will bring to you some of the biggest issues that exist in our world today. Each programme will tackle a different crisis, from conflict zones and gender equality through to recession and child labour. Nearly 3 billion people survive on less than £1 a day, and almost half the people on the planet live in extreme poverty. In today's programme, we'll be speaking to some of these people who are barely surviving and asking with whom does the responsibility lie for poverty. We all know the catchphrase, make poverty history, but will it ever be a reality? Is it a task beyond human efforts? And what are the solutions? So, how do we characterise poverty? Let's begin by asking the great British public what they know on this matter.
Impoverished people in third world countries with a lack of money, food.
Just a bit of a hanger, really, just a bit like people can't find, the way to survive, really. Kind of, just to find, the food on a daily basis, a bit struggle for them. That's poverty for me.
It's really hard to say because it's very elusive. You don't know when a person is poor or when he's not.
Poverty means to me, somebody who I guess is homeless or somebody who even has a home and is just struggling to even pay the bills, put food on the table.
As you can see, people have different views and ideas, but what's the universal definition of poverty? Emma Fitzsimons from the Institute of Fiscal Studies explains.
So poverty is defined as having little or no resources and thus lacking access to the basic necessities of life, such as food, shelter and clean water. A broader definition of poverty also recognises that it's not having the capabilities to realise one's full potential as a human being. Now, there are two main ways of measuring poverty: absolute poverty and relative poverty. Absolute poverty is the total absence of the most basic needs in life, such as food, shelter, healthcare and education. Relative poverty is lacking resources that are needed to obtain the most basic standard of living in the particular society in which an individual lives. Now, in developing countries, where large shares of the population survive on the bare minimum or less, often the more relevant measure to consider is absolute poverty. So the World Bank defines absolute poverty as living on the equivalent of $1.25 per day or less. And that's an amount considered necessary to achieve one's basic food and other survival needs, regardless of where one lives. So that's just £1 per day. And on that estimate, there are 1.4 billion people currently living in absolute poverty.
According to the United Nations, 25,000 people die every single day of hunger or hunger-related causes. This is a shocking 1 person every 3.5 seconds. Is it because there isn't enough food in the world? No. It's been argued that there is between 1.5 times and 3 times enough food to feed everyone on the planet. The problem we have is not so much to do with supply, but distribution. Every year, 30 to 50% of food is not distributed to anyone. In the UK alone, we waste £10 billion of food every year. The obesity rate in the UK is 26%, whereas 30% of those in the sub-Sahara are malnourished. Fair trade practice has received increasing criticism from experts in the field because developing countries often don't get a fair share of the global trade market. Just imagine, 90% of the world's grain trade is controlled by 5 multinational companies who have the ability to control food prices. The causes of poverty are multifold, from famine and natural disasters to population imbalance and government policies. In recent times, bad decisions made by the banking sector and financial crises worldwide have had a devastating effect on numerous countries, driving even more people into extreme poverty. A line of adults and children, some with bowls in their hands, stretched outside and onto the dust-filled streets at a soup kitchen in the Via Piletones slum in Buenos Aires. For these people, it's necessary to be reliant on charity in order to make ends meet. A sharp currency devaluation in Argentina in recent months has worsened one of the world's highest inflation rates. Most economists say inflation is running at more than 25% a year, compared with government data that has put annual inflation at just over 10%. Daniel Arroyo, a professor at the University of Buenos Aires and former Vice Minister of Social Development under existing President Cristina Kirchner, commented on the current state of social problems being experienced by the people of Argentina.
Clearly, Argentina, of all situations, is better than it was 10 years ago, but things have become more complicated. The trend has changed, and the problem is how we reverse it again, to change the tendency which requires private economic activity, generate investment, and to define which productive sectors will generate employment in the next few years.
Argentina ranked among the richest countries in the world in the early 20th century, thanks to its booming beef and wheat exports. However, a succession of financial crises in recent decades battered its well-educated middle class. As much as half of the country fell into poverty during the economic collapse that followed a record 2002 sovereign debt default. 1 in 4 Argentine families now rely on state welfare programs ranging from payouts for the unemployed to scholarships for poor high school students. Decisions and policies are driven by leaders of rich countries and multinational corporations, leaving governments of less developed countries powerless. As a result, a few get wealthy whilst the majority struggle. The effects and hardships of poverty are numerous. Let's take a look at some of the struggles of the less fortunate.
Hunger.
Poverty is inextricably linked with hunger, undernourishment and malnutrition. With minimal or no income, people struggle to feed themselves, making them more susceptible to illness.
Health inequality.
The poorest people have less access to healthcare due to a lack of local services, resources, technologies and medical care.
Illiteracy.
A lack of education hinders social mobility. Almost 1 billion people entered the 21st century unable to read or sign their names.
Agriculture.
This is at the very core of our societies. From natural disasters to man-made problems, issues affecting agriculture can be devastating, preventing farmers from growing crops, thus impacting communities locally and further afield. These are just some of the contributing factors to poverty. Will this cycle ever end? To get a global perspective on matters, I caught up with Dr. Elliot Green, an expert in global development. What is the impact of poverty globally?
I would say there's 2 issues here. One is that if we in the developed world see poverty in the developing world, there's a natural instinct among humans to want to help out to other humans. We are all compassionate. So you see poverty, you want to help. It's a natural instinct, and I think that's something that's universal. That's one issue. A second issue is that there's a lot of academic literature that suggests that there's a strong impact of poverty on conflict. It does seem that people who are poor, countries which are poor, tend to erupt more in conflict, civil wars, genocide, various types of violence. So if we were to solve global poverty, we would also not just solve poverty, we'd solve a lot of conflict around the world.
How can poverty be addressed effectively in countries where there's corruption in government?
Well, the first thing to say about corruption is that it's actually quite universal. If we look at the history of countries like the UK, US, France, Western Europe, and also from what are now developed countries but were recently not too rich, including places like Thailand, China, South Korea, they were all very corrupt when they were developing, so it's quite universal. Now, in terms of how do we address poverty in corrupt countries, one thing we can talk about is focusing on private sector development, creating jobs, creating economic growth, industrialization, bypassing government and focusing on that instead.
There are different types of aid, ranging from food aid to military assistance and from emergency assistance to longer-term development. But there seems to be criticism around these, the main criticisms being the inefficiency of delivery and political agendas. What's your response?
The first thing to say is that I think there's a lot of evidence suggesting that aid to countries at conflict and aid to the absolute poor is very efficient. It's much more efficient than more complex types of aid. And that's something that we've seen very clearly when it comes to food aid to areas that have famines. And this can actually come from a variety of donors. It even comes from where we have situations where donors have complex geopolitical agendas. But the point is that the aid that arrives is still very useful to people there. The other thing to say as well is that there's a lot of evidence suggesting that countries which have good governments, that are not extremely corrupt, that are good at providing for their people, are the ones who are most likely to benefit from aid. And there's a lot of arguments suggesting that those are the countries we should focus on.
We may have trouble relating to the experiences of those around the globe, and the images we see in our newspapers and our TVs may appear foreign. Is this a world away from our own lives, or does the truth lie closer to home?
Everywhere in the UK, I think, even on the affluent road like this, I think there's poverty along it.
It's more likely the poverty is north of the country, and also in some of the areas in underprivileged areas in London as well.
I guess primarily poverty does exist, mainly outside of London.
Oh, definitely, it exists everywhere, because there are too many people and too little job opportunities, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. More so up north, I believe, Liverpool, Manchester, places like that. I really do believe that.
There are families often only streets away who are struggling to feed their children, and teachers are increasingly witnessing students go hungry. Imagine yourself as an individual teetering on the edge. What happens when you slip and fall into the abyss of homelessness?